Meetings with Remarkable Men by George Gurdjieff. Introduction. Exactly a month has elapsed since I finished the first series of my writings. Just that period of the flow of time which I intended to devote exclusively to resting the parts of my common presence subordinate to my pure reason. As I wrote in the last chapter of the first series, I had given myself my word that during the whole of this time I would do no writing whatsoever, but would only, for the well-being of the most deserving of these subordinate parts, slowly and gently drink down all the bottles of old Calvados, now at my disposal by the will of fate, in the wine cellar of the Prieuré, and specially provided the century before last by people who understood the true sense of life. Today I have decided, and now I wish, without forcing myself at all, but on the contrary with great pleasure, to set to work at my writing again. Of course, with the help of all the corresponding forces, and also this time, with the help of the law-conformable cosmic results flowing in from all sides upon my person from the good wishes of the readers of the first series. I now propose to give a form, understandable for everyone, to everything I have written down for this second series, in the hope that these ideas may serve as preparatory constructive material for setting up in the consciousness of creatures similar to myself a new world. A world, in my opinion, real, or at least one that can be perceived as real by all degrees of human thinking, without the slightest impulse of doubt, instead of the illusory world which contemporary people picture to themselves. And indeed, the mind of contemporary man, of whatever level of intellectuality, is only able to take cognizance of the world by means of data which, whenever accidentally or intentionally activated, aroused in him all sorts of fantastic impulses. And these impulses, by constantly affecting the tempo of all the associations flowing in him, gradually disharmonize the whole of his functioning, with such sorrowful results that it is impossible for any man, if he is able to isolate himself even a little from the influences of the established abnormal conditions of our ordinary life, and is willing to think about it seriously, not to be terrified, as, for example, by the shortening of our life with each decade. First of all, for the swing of thought, that is, for establishing a corresponding rhythm for my thinking, and also for yours, I wish to follow somewhat the example of the great Beelzebub and imitate the form of thinking of one highly respected by him and by me, and perhaps already, brave reader of my writings, by you, if of course you have had the daring to read through to the end all of the first series. That is to say, I wish to introduce at the very beginning of this writing of mine what our dear to all Mullah Nasr ad-Din would call a subtly philosophical question. I wish to do this at the very beginning because I intend to use freely, both here and in my later expositions, the wisdom of this sage, who is now recognized almost everywhere and upon whom it is rumored the title of the One and Only is soon to be officially conferred by the proper person. And this subtly philosophical question may already be sensed in that sort of perplexity which is bound to arise in the consciousness of every reader of even the very first paragraph of this chapter, if he compares the many data on which his firm convictions about medical matters are based, with the fact that I, author of Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, after the accident which nearly cost me my life, with the functioning of my organism not yet fully re-established owing to the incessant active effort to set down my thoughts for transmission to others as exactly as possible, carried out my rest quite satisfactorily during this time, chiefly by the use of immoderate quantities of alcohol, in the form of the above-mentioned Old Calvados, and of its various full-strength virile cousins. As a matter of fact, to give a completely true and exhaustive reply to this subtly philosophical question thus propounded impromptu, one must first reach a just verdict on my personal guilt in failing to fulfill exactly the obligation I had taken upon myself, to drink down all the remaining bottles of the said Old Calvados. The point is that during this time appointed for my rest, despite all my automatic desire, I could not limit myself to the 15 bottles of Old Calvados which I mentioned in the last chapter of the first series, but had to combine the sublime contents of these bottles with the contents of 200 other bottles, enchanting even to look upon, of the no less sublime liquid called Old Armagnac, so that this totality of cosmic substances might suffice for me personally, as well as for the whole tribe of those who have become in recent years my inevitable assistants, chiefly in these sacred ceremonies of mine. Before pronouncing this verdict on my personal guilt, one must finally take into account that from the very first day I changed my custom of drinking Armagnac from what are called liqueur glasses, and began drinking it from what are called tumblers. And I began to do so instinctively, it seems to me, obviously so that, in the present case also, justice might triumph. I do not know about you, brave reader, but the rhythm of my thinking is now established, and I can begin again, without forcing myself to wiseacre in full blast. In this second series, I intend, among other things, to introduce and elucidate 7 sayings, which have come down to our day from very ancient times by means of inscriptions on various monuments, which I happened to come across and deciphered during my travels. Sayings in which our remote ancestors formulated certain aspects of objective truth, clearly perceptible even to contemporary human reason. I shall therefore begin with just one saying, which, besides serving as a good starting point for the expositions which follow, will be a link with the last chapter of the first series. This ancient saying, chosen by me for the beginning of the second series of my writings, is formulated thus: "Only he will deserve the name of man, and can count upon anything prepared for him from above, who has already acquired corresponding data for being able to preserve intact both the wolf and the sheep confided to his care." A psycho-associative philological analysis of this saying of our ancestors, which was made by certain learned men of our times, of course not from among those breeding on the continent of Europe, clearly showed that the word wolf symbolizes the whole of the fundamental and reflex functioning of the human organism, and the word sheep the whole of the functioning of a man's feeling. As for the functioning of a man's thinking, this is represented in the saying by the man himself, a man who, in the process of his responsible life, owing to his conscious labors and voluntary sufferings, has acquired in his common presence corresponding data for always being able to create conditions for a possible existence, together, of these two heterogeneous and mutually alien lives. Only such a man can count upon and become worthy to possess that which, as affirmed in this saying, is prepared from above and is in general foreordained for man. It is interesting to note that among the many proverbs and ingenious solutions of tricky problems habitually used by various Asiatic tribes, there is one in which a wolf and, instead of a sheep, a goat also plays their part, that corresponds very well, in my opinion, to the gist of the ancient saying I have quoted. The question posed by this tricky problem is to find out how a man who has in his possession a wolf, a goat, and, in the present case, a cabbage, can transfer them across a river from one bank to the other, if one takes into consideration on the one hand that his boat can carry only the load of himself and one of the three objects at a time, and on the other hand that without his direct observation and influence the wolf can always destroy the goat, and the goat the cabbage. And the correct answer to this popular riddle clearly shows that a man can achieve this not solely by means of the ingenuity which every normal man should have, but in addition he must not be lazy nor spare his strength, but must cross the river an extra time for the attainment of his aim. Returning to the meaning of the ancient saying chosen by me, and keeping in mind the gist of the correct solution of this popular riddle, then if one thinks about it, without any of the preconceptions always arising from the results of the idle thoughts usual to contemporary man, it is impossible not to admit with one's mind, and agree with one's feelings, that anyone calling himself a man must never be lazy, but, constantly devising all sorts of compromises, must struggle with his self-avowed weaknesses in order to attain the aim he has set himself, to preserve intact these two independent animals confided to the care of his reason, and which are by their very essence opposite to each other. Having yesterday finished this, as I call it, wiseacring for the swing of thought, this morning I took with me the manuscript of a synopsis I had written in the first 2 years of my activities as a writer, which I intended to use as material for the beginning of this second series, and went into the park to sit down and work in the shade of the historic avenue of trees. After reading the first 2 or 3 pages, forgetting everything around me, I became deeply thoughtful, pondering on how to continue further, and I sat there without writing a single word until very late in the evening. I was so wrapped up in these reflections that I did not once notice that the youngest of my nieces, the one whose task it is to see that the Arabian coffee which I usually take, particularly when doing any intensely active physical or mental work, does not become quite cold in the cup, changed it, as I afterwards learned, 23 times. In order that you may understand the seriousness of this engrossed thoughtfulness of mine, and picture to yourself, if only approximately, the difficulty of my situation, I must tell you that, after I had read these passages and remembered by association the entire contents of the manuscript I had intended to make use of as an introduction, it became quite clear to me that all this, over which I had said, as is said, panted during so many sleepless nights, would now, after the changes and additions I had made in the final editing of the first series, be of no use at all. When I understood this, I experienced for about half an hour the state which Mullah Nasr ad-Din defines by the words, "to feel oneself plunged in galoshes up to the eyebrows," and I was ready at first to resign myself, and came to the decision to rewrite this entire chapter from beginning to end. But afterwards, continuing to recall automatically all sorts of sentences from my manuscript, I remembered, among other things, the place where, in order to explain why I took an attitude of merciless criticism towards contemporary literature, I had introduced the words of a certain intelligent elderly Persian, which I had heard in my early youth, and which in my opinion could not have better described the characteristics of contemporary civilization. I considered it impossible to deprive the reader either of what had been said on this subject, or of all the other thoughts, so to say, artfully embedded in this passage, thoughts which, for anyone able to decipher them, can be exceedingly valuable material for a correct understanding of what I intend to elucidate in the last 2 series in a form accessible to any man seeking the truth. And so, These considerations compelled me to think out just how, without the reader being deprived of all this, it could be possible for the form of exposition I had first employed to correspond to the form now required after the great changes made in the first series. In fact, what I had written during the first 2 years of this new profession of mine, which I was forced to adopt, could no longer correspond to what was now required, since I had then put down everything as a first version in the form of a synopsis understandable only to myself, intending to develop all this material into 36 books, devoting each book to one special question. In the 3rd year, I had begun to give to this outline a form of exposition which might be understandable to others, at least to those specially trained in, so to say, abstract thinking. But since, little by little, I had become more adroit in the art of concealing serious thoughts in an enticing, easily grasped outer form, and in making all those thoughts which I term discernible only with the lapse of time, ensue from others usual to the thinking of most contemporary people, I changed the principle I had been following, and instead of seeking to achieve the aim I had set myself in writing by quantity, I adopted the principle of attaining this by quality alone. And I began to go over from the beginning everything I had written in the synopsis, with the intention now of dividing it into 3 series, and of dividing each of these, in the final version, into several books. And my becoming so deeply thoughtful today was perhaps also because just yesterday there had been freshly revived in my memory the wise ancient saying, "Always to strive that the wolf be full and the sheep intact." Finally, when evening drew nigh, and from below the famous Fontainebleau dampness began to come through my English soles, and affect my thinking, while from above various of God's dear little creatures called little birds began to evoke more and more frequently a chilly sensation on my completely smooth cranium, there arose in my common presence the bold decision not to have any regard for any one or anything, but simply to insert in this first chapter of the 2nd series, as what present-day professional writers would call a digressive development, certain polished-up fragments of this manuscript, pleasing to me personally, and only afterwards, in continuing further, to hold myself strictly to the principle I had decided upon the writing of this series. And this solution will be all the better both for me and for the reader, since I will thus be spared any extra new exertion of my already over-exhausted brains, and the reader, particularly if he has read through everything I have written before, will be able, owing to this digressive development, to represent to himself what kind of objectively impartial opinion is formed in the psyche of certain people, who have by chance been more or less correctly educated, concerning the results of the manifestations of people of present-day civilization. When this introduction was originally planned for the 30th book, I entitled it "Why I Became a Writer," and described in it the impressions accumulated in me in the course of my life, which are the basis of my present not very flattering opinion of the representatives of contemporary literature. In this connection, I have already said, I introduced the speech which I had heard long ago in my youth, when I was in Persia for the first time, and happened one day to be in a gathering of Persian intelligentsia, where contemporary literature was being discussed. One of those who spoke a great deal that day was the elderly, intelligent Persian whom I have mentioned. Intelligent not in the European sense of the word, but in the sense in which it is understood on the continent of Asia, that is, not only by knowledge, but by being. He was very well educated and was particularly well acquainted with European culture. He said, among other things, It is a great pity that the present period of culture, which we call, and which people of subsequent generations will of course also call, the European civilization, is, in the whole process of the perfecting of humanity, as it were, an empty and abortive interval. And this is because, in respect of the development of the mind, that chief impeller to self-perfection, the people of our civilization cannot transmit by inheritance anything of value to their descendants. For example, one of the chief means for developing the mind of man is literature. But what has the literature of contemporary civilization to give? Nothing whatever except the development of, so to say, word prostitution. The fundamental cause of this corruption of present-day literature is, in my opinion, that the whole attention in writing has gradually, of itself, come to be concentrated not on the quality of the thought and the exactitude with which it is transmitted, but only on the striving for exterior polish, or, as is otherwise said, beauty of style, thanks to which there has finally resulted what I call word prostitution. And in fact, you can spend a whole day reading a lengthy book and not know what the writer wished to say. And only when you have nearly finished, after having wasted so much of your time, already insufficient for the fulfillment of the necessary obligations of life, do you discover that all this music was built up on an infinitesimal, almost null idea. All contemporary literature falls by content into three categories. The first covers what is called the scientific field, the second consists in narratives, and the third of what are called descriptions. The scientific books usually contain collections of all sorts of old hypotheses already obvious to everyone, but combined in different ways and applied to various new subjects. In the narratives, or as they are otherwise called, novels, to which bulky volumes are also devoted, for the most part there are descriptions, without sparing any details, of how some John Jones and Mary Smith attained the satisfaction of their love, that sacred feeling which has gradually degenerated in people, owing to their weakness and willlessness, and has now in contemporary man turned completely into a vice, whereas the possibility of its natural manifestation was given to us by our Creator for our salvation of our souls, and for the mutual moral support necessary for a more or less happy life together. The third category of books gives descriptions of travels, of adventures, and of flora and fauna, of the most diverse countries. Works of this kind are generally written by people who have never been anywhere and have never in reality seen anything, by people who, as is said, have never crossed their own doorsteps, with very few exceptions. They simply give rein to their imagination or copy various fragments from books written by others, former fantasists just like themselves. With this puny understanding of the responsibility and significance of literary works, the writers of today, in striving ever more and more for beauty of style, sometimes even invent an incredible hodgepodge in verse in order to obtain what, in their opinion, is beauty of consonance, and thereby even further destroy the already feeble sense of everything they write. Strange as it may seem to you, in my opinion, a great deal of harm to contemporary literature has been brought about by grammars, namely the grammars of the languages of all the peoples, who take part in what I call the common malphonic concert of contemporary civilization. The grammars of their different languages are in most cases constructed artificially, and have been composed and continue to be altered chiefly by a category of people who, in respect of understanding real life, and the language evolved from it for mutual relations, are quite illiterate. On the other hand, among all the peoples of past epochs, as ancient history very definitely shows us, Grammar was always formed gradually by life itself, according to the different stages of their development, the climatic conditions of their chief place of existence, and the predominant means of obtaining food. In present-day civilization, the grammars of certain languages so greatly distort the meaning of what the writer wishes to transmit that the reader, especially if he is a foreigner, is deprived of the last possibility of grasping even the few minute thoughts which, if expressed differently, that is, without this grammar, might perhaps still be understood. In order to make clearer what I've just said, this elderly intelligent Persian continued. I will give as an example an episode which took place in my own life. As you know, of all the persons near to me by blood, the only one still living is my nephew on the paternal side, who a few years ago, having inherited an oil well situated in the environs of Baku, was obliged to move there. And so I go from time to time to that town, because my nephew, being always very occupied with his numerous commercial affairs, is seldom able to leave and visit me, his old uncle, here at our birthplace. The district where these oil wells are located, and also the town of Baku, belong at the present time to Russia, which, as one of the large nations of contemporary civilization, produces an abundance of literature. Almost all the inhabitants of the town of Baku and its environs are of diverse races, having nothing in common with the Russians, and in their own households they speak their native languages, but for outer mutual relations they are compelled to use Russian. During my visits there, I came in contact with all kinds of people, and having to speak with them for various personal needs, I decided to learn this language. I had had to learn so many languages in my lifetime that the learning of Russian did not present any great difficulty for me. Before very long I was able to speak it quite fluently, but of course, like all the local inhabitants, with an accent, and only after a fashion. As one who has now become to some degree a linguist, I consider it necessary to remark here by the way that it is never possible to think in a foreign language, even though knowing it to perfection, if one continues to speak one's native language or some other language in which one is accustomed to thinking. And therefore when I began to speak Russian, continuing all the while to think in Persian, I was searching mentally for words in the Russian language to correspond to my Persian thoughts. And it was then that I became aware of various incongruities, at first quite inexplicable to me, in this contemporary civilized language, on account of which it was sometimes impossible to transmit exactly the simplest and most ordinary expressions of our thoughts. Becoming interested in this and being free of all life obligations, I began to study Russian grammar, and later the grammars of several other languages. I then understood that the cause of the incongruities I had noticed lay precisely in these artificially composed grammars of theirs, and there began to be formed in me the firm conviction which I have just expressed to you, that the grammars of these languages in which contemporary literature is written are invented by people who, in respect of true knowledge, are on a lower level than ordinary simple people. As a concrete illustration of what I've just said, I shall point out, among the many incongruities in the Russian language which I noticed at the very beginning, the one that led me to make a detailed study of this question. Once, when I was conversing in Russian, and as usual was translating my thoughts, which formed themselves Persian fashion, I found it necessary to use an expression which we Persians often employ in conversation, "Mian diaram," which means in French, "je dis," and in English, "I say." But try as I might, searching my memory for a corresponding word in Russian, I could not find one. in spite of my knowing by this time almost all the words of this language used either in literature or for the ordinary mutual relations of people of all levels of intellectuality. Not finding a corresponding word for this simple expression so often used by us, I of course at first decided that I simply did not yet know it, and I began to search in my numerous dictionaries and to inquire of certain people who were considered authorities for some Russian word which would correspond to this Persian meaning of mine. However, it turned out that in modern Russian there is no such word at all, but instead a word is used, namely, Ya govoryu, which means in Persian, Mian soil yaram, in French, Je parle, and in English, I speak. Since you Persians have the same sort of thinking faculty as I have for digesting the meaning conveyed by words, I therefore ask you, could I, or any other Persian, on reading in contemporary Russian literature a word corresponding to the meaning of soil yaram, accept it without instinctive disturbance as having the same meaning as the word diaram? Of course not. Soil yaram and diaram, or speak and say, are two quite different experienced actions. This very minor example is characteristic of thousands of other incongruities to be found in all the languages of the people who represent the so-called flower of contemporary civilization. And it is these incongruities which prevent the literature of today from serving as the basic means for developing the minds of those people who are considered representatives of this civilization, and also of those peoples who at the present time, obviously for reasons already suspected by certain persons with common sense, are somehow deprived of the good fortune of being considered civilized, and are therefore, as historical data bear witness, usually called backward. Owing to all these incongruities of language existing in contemporary literature, any man, particularly a man from races not included among the representatives of contemporary civilization, who has more or less normal thinking faculty, and is able to give words their real meaning, will of course, on hearing or reading any word used in an incorrect sense, as in the example just given, perceive the general thought of a sentence according to this incorrectly employed word, and as a result will grasp something quite different from what the sentence was intended to express. Although the ability to grasp the meaning contained in words differs in different races, the data for sensing the repeated experienced actions, which are already well established in the process of the life of people, are formed in all of them alike by life itself. The very absence in the present-day Russian language of a word exactly expressing the meaning of the Persian word diaram, which I have taken as an example, can serve to confirm my seemingly unfounded statement that the illiterate upstarts of our time, who call themselves grammarians, and what is worse are considered such by those round them, have succeeded in transforming even the language elaborated by life itself into, so to say, German ersatz. I must tell you here that when I began to study Russian grammar, and also the grammars of several other modern languages in order to determine the causes of these numerous incongruities, I decided, being in general attracted to philology, to acquaint myself also with the history of the origins and development of the Russian language. And my study of its history proved to me that formerly it had contained exactly corresponding words for all the experienced actions already fixed in the process of the life of people. And it was only when this language, having reached a relatively high degree of development in the course of centuries, became in its turn an object for the sharpening of the beaks of ravens, that is to say, an object of wiseacring for various illiterate upstarts, that many words were distorted and even entirely ceased to be used, merely because their consonants did not answer to the requirements of civilized grammar. Among these latter was the very word I searched for, which exactly corresponded to our diaram, and which was then pronounced skazivayu. It is interesting to notice that this word has been preserved even up to the present time, but is used, and in the sense exactly corresponding to its meaning, only by people who, although they belong to the Russian nation, happen to be isolated from the effects of present-day civilization. That is to say, by people of various country districts situated far from any center of culture. This artificially invented grammar of the languages of today, which the younger generation everywhere is now compelled to learn, is, in my opinion, one of the fundamental causes of the fact that among contemporary European people, only one of the three independent data necessary for obtaining a sane human mind has developed, namely their so-called thought, which tends to predominate in their individuality, whereas without feeling and instinct, as every man with a normal reason must know, the real understanding accessible to man cannot be formed. To sum up, everything that has been said about the literature of our times, I cannot find better words to describe it than the expression, "It has no soul." Contemporary civilization has destroyed the soul of literature, as of everything else to which it has turned its gracious attention. I have all the more grounds for criticizing so mercilessly this result of modern civilization, since, according to the most reliable historical data which have come down to us from a remote antiquity, we have definite information that the literature of former civilizations had indeed a great deal to assist the development of the mind of man. And the results of this development, transmitted from generation to generation, could still be felt even centuries later. In my opinion, the quintessence of an idea can sometimes be very well transmitted to others by means of certain anecdotes and proverbs formed by life. So in the present case, in order to show the difference between the literature of former civilizations and the contemporary, I wish to make use of an anecdote, very widely known among us in Persia, entitled The Conversation of the Two Sparrows. In this anecdote it is said that once upon a time on the cornice of a high house sat two sparrows, one old, the other young. They were discussing an event which had become the burning question of the day among the sparrows, and which had resulted from the mullah's housekeeper having just previously thrown out of the window onto a place where the sparrows gathered to play something looking like leftover porridge, but which turned out to be chopped cork. And several of the young, as yet inexperienced sparrows had sampled it and almost burst. While talking about this, the old sparrow, suddenly ruffling himself up, began with a pained grimace to search under his wing for the fleas tormenting him, and which in general breed on underfed sparrows. And having caught one, he said with a deep sigh, "Times have changed very much. There is no longer a living to be had for our fraternity. In the old days we used to sit, just as now, somewhere upon a roof, quietly dozing, when suddenly down in the street there would be heard a noise, a rattling and a rumbling, and soon after an odor would be diffused, at which everything inside us would begin to rejoice, because we felt fully certain that when we flew down and searched the places where all that had happened, we would find satisfaction for our essential needs. But nowadays there is plenty and to spare of noise and rattlings and all sorts of rumblings, and again an odor is also diffused, but an odor which it is almost impossible to endure. And when sometimes by force of old habit we fly down during a moment's lull to seek something substantial for ourselves, then search as we may with tense attention, we find nothing at all, except some nauseous drops of burned oil. This tale, as is surely evident to you, refers to the old horse-drawn vehicles and to the present-day automobiles. And although these latter, as the old sparrow said, produce even more noise, rumblings, rattlings, and smell than the former, in spite of all this they have no significance whatever for the feeding of sparrows. And without food, as you yourself will understand, it is difficult even for sparrows to bring forth a healthy posterity. This anecdote seems to me an ideal illustration of what I wish to point out about the difference between contemporary civilization and the civilization of past epochs. In the present civilization, as in former civilizations, literature exists for the purpose of the perfecting of humanity in general. But in this field also, as in everything else contemporary, there is nothing substantial for our essential aim. It is all exterior, all only, as in the tale of the old sparrow, noise, rattling, and a nauseous smell. For any impartial man, this viewpoint of mine can be conclusively confirmed by observing the difference between the degree of development of feeling in people who are born and spend their whole lives on the continent of Asia, and in people born and educated in the conditions of contemporary civilization on the continent of Europe. It is a fact, noted by a great many people, that among all the present-day inhabitants of the continent of Asia, who, owing to geographical and other conditions, are isolated from the effects of modern civilization, feeling has reached a much higher level of development than among any of the inhabitants of Europe. And since feeling is the foundation of common sense, these Asiatic people, in spite of having less general knowledge, have a more correct notion of any object they observe than those belonging to the very tzimmus of contemporary civilization. A European's understanding of an object observed by him is formed exclusively by means of an all-round, so to say, mathematical informedness about it, whereas most of the people of Asia grasp the essence of the object observed by them, sometimes with their feelings alone, and sometimes even solely by instinct. At this point in his speech about contemporary literature, this intelligent elderly Persian, among other things, touched on a question which at the present time is interesting many European, as they are called, propagators of culture. He then said, "The people of Asia were at one time greatly interested in European literature, but soon feeling all the emptiness of its content, they gradually lost interest in it, and now it is scarcely read there at all. In the weakening of their interest in European literature, the chief part, in my opinion, was played by that branch of modern writing known by the name of novels. These famous novels of theirs consist mainly, as I've already said, of long descriptions in various forms of the course of a malady which has arisen among contemporary people, and which, owing to their weakness and will-lessness, lasts rather a long time. The Asiatic people, who are not as yet so far removed from Mother Nature, recognize with their consciousness that this psychic state which arises in both men and women is unworthy of human beings in general, and is particularly degrading for a man, and instinctively they assume an attitude of contempt towards such people. And as regards the other branches of European literature, such as the scientific, the descriptive, and other forms of instructive exposition, the Asiatic, having lost to a lesser degree the ability to feel, that is to say, standing closer to nature, half-consciously feels and instinctively senses the writer's complete lack of any knowledge of reality and of any genuine understanding of the subject he is writing about. And so, because of all this, the Asiatic people, after first manifesting a great interest in European literature, gradually stopped paying any attention to it, and at the present time disregard it completely. Whereas among the European peoples, the shelves of their public and private libraries and bookshops are groaning from the daily increasing number of new books. The question must doubtless arise in many of you as to how what I have just said can be reconciled with the fact that an overwhelming majority of the people of Asia are illiterate in the strict sense of the word. To this I will answer that, nevertheless, the real cause of the lack of interest in contemporary literature lies in its own shortcomings. I myself have seen how hundreds of illiterate people will gather round one literate man to hear a reading of the sacred writings or the tales known as the 1001 Nights. You will, of course, reply that the events described, particularly in these tales, are taken from their own life, and are therefore understandable and interesting to them. But that is not the point. These texts, and I speak particularly of the 1001 Nights, are works of literature in the full sense of the word. Anyone reading or hearing this book feels clearly that everything in it is fantasy, but fantasy corresponding to truth, even though composed of episodes which are quite improbable for the ordinary life of people. The interest of the reader or listener is awakened and enchanted by the author's fine understanding of the psyche of people of all walks of life round him. He follows with curiosity how, little by little, a whole story is formed out of these small incidents of actual life. The requirements of contemporary civilization have engendered yet another quite specific form of literature called journalism. I cannot pass in silence this new form of literature, since, aside from the fact that it offers nothing whatsoever for the development of the mind, it has, from my point of view, become the fundamental evil in the life of people today, because of the poisonous influence it exerts on their mutual relations. This form of literature has become very widespread in recent times because, according to my unshakable conviction, it answers more completely than anything else to the weaknesses and demands which lead to the ever-increasing willlessness of man. It thus accelerates in people the atrophy of even their last possibilities for acquiring those data which formerly still gave them a certain relative cognizance of their own individuality, which alone leads to what we call remembering oneself, that absolutely necessary factor in the process of self-perfecting. Besides, owing to this unprincipled daily literature, the thinking function of people has come to be even further separated from their individuality, and thereby conscience, which was occasionally awakened in them, has now ceased to participate in this thinking of theirs. They are thus deprived of those factors which formerly gave people a more or less tolerable life, if only in respect of their mutual relations. To our common misfortune, this journalistic literature, which is becoming more widespread in the life of people year by year, weakens the already weakened mind of man still more by laying it open without resistance to all kinds of deceit and delusion, and leads it astray from relatively well-founded thinking, thus stimulating in people, instead of sane judgment, various unworthy properties such as incredulity, indignation, fear, false shame, hypocrisy, pride, and so on and so forth. In order to portray to you more concretely all the maleficence for people of this new form of literature, I will tell you about several events which took place on account of newspapers, the reality of which was for me beyond all doubt, as by chance I had personally taken part in them. In Tehran, I had a certain close friend, an Armenian, who some time before his death had made me his executor. He had a son, no longer young, who on account of his business lived with numerous family in a large European city. One sad evening, after having eaten their supper, he and the members of his family all fell ill and died before morning. As executor of the family, I was obliged to go to the place where this tragic event had occurred. I found out that just before this event, the father of this unfortunate family had read long articles for several days in succession in one of the various newspapers he received about a butcher shop where, according to these articles, special sausages were made from genuine products in some particular way. At the same time, he kept coming across large advertisements of this new butcher shop in all the newspapers. Finally, all this so tempted him that, although neither he nor his family cared for sausages very much, as all of them had been raised in Armenia, where sausages are not eaten, he went and bought some. And having had these sausages for supper that same evening, all the family were mortally poisoned. My suspicions having been aroused by this extraordinary occurrence, I succeeded, a little later, with the cooperation of an agent of the private secret police, in bringing to light the following. Some large firm had acquired, at a low price from an export concern, an enormous consignment of sausages originally destined for a foreign country, which had been rejected owing to a delay in shipment. To get rid of the entire consignment as quickly as possible, this firm spared no expense on reporters, to whom it entrusted this maleficent campaign in the newspapers. Another occurrence. During one of my stays in Baku, I myself, for several days in succession, read in the local newspapers obtained by my nephew lengthy articles, taking up nearly half the entire paper, which went into ecstasies about the marvels performed by some famous actress. So much was written about her, and in such a handsome way, that even I, an old man, was, as is said, fired by it all, and one evening, putting off everything I had to do and changing my established evening regime, I went to the theater to see this wonder. And what do you think I saw? Something corresponding, even in the slightest, to what had been written about in these articles which filled up half the paper? Nothing of the sort. I had seen in my day many representatives of this art, both the good and the bad, and without exaggeration I can say that for some time I had been considered a great authority on these matters. But even without taking into consideration my personal views on art in general, and speaking merely from an ordinary standpoint, I must confess that in all my life I had never seen anybody to compare with this celebrity for lack of talent and absence of even the most elementary notions of the principles of playing a role. In all her manifestations on the stage, there was such a complete lack of any kind of presence that I personally, even if aroused to altruism, would not have permitted such a wonder to fill the role of kitchen maid in my kitchen. As I afterwards learned, one of the typical oil refiners of Baku, who had happened to make a fortune, had paid several reporters a good round sum as a bribe, promising to double it if they should succeed in making a celebrity of his private lady love, who up till then had been chambermaid in the house of a Russian engineer, and whom he had seduced, taking advantage of business appointments with this engineer. One more example. In a widely circulated German newspaper I read, from time to time, lofty panegyrics glorifying a certain painter, and owing to these articles I formed the opinion that in contemporary art this painter was simply a phenomenon. My nephew, having just built a house in the town of Baku, had decided, in preparation for his wedding, to decorate the interior very richly. Since twice that year he had unexpectedly struck oil with signs of increasing output, which would assure him a considerable fortune. I advised him not to spare his money, but to send for that famous painter, to superintend the decoration of the house, and to paint some frescoes on the walls. In this way his expenditures, already very great, would at least be of benefit to his posterity, who would inherit these frescoes and other works by the hand of this incomparable master. And my nephew did so. He even went himself to invite this great European painter. And soon afterwards the painter arrived, bringing with him a whole train of assistants, artisans, and even, it seemed to me, his own harem. Of course, in the European sense of the word, and without the slightest hurry he finally set to work. The result of the work of this celebrity was that, firstly, the day of the wedding had to be postponed, and, secondly, no little money had to be spent to bring everything back to its original state, so that simple Persian artisans might decorate, paint, and embellish everything in a way more corresponding to genuine artistry. In the present case, to give them their due, the reporters participated in building up the career of this mediocre painter almost disinterestedly, simply as comrades and modest sideline workers. As a last example, I will tell you a sad story of misunderstanding which was due this time to a big shot of this contemporary, especially pernicious literature. One day when I was living in the town of Khorasan, I met at the house of mutual acquaintances a young European couple and soon got to know them rather well. They came to Khorasan several times, but each time only for a short stay. Traveling with his young wife, this new friend of mine was collecting all kinds of information in many countries, and making analysis to determine the effects of the nicotine in various kinds of tobacco on the human organism and psyche. After collecting the data he needed on this question in several Asiatic countries, he returned with his wife to Europe, where he began to write a long book on the results of his research. But since his young wife, obviously owing to her youth and inexperience as regards the necessity of preparing for what are called rainy days, had spent all their resources during these travels of theirs, she was compelled, in order to give her husband the possibility of finishing his book, to take employment as a typist in the office of a large publishing house. There often came to this office a certain literary critic who met her there, and having, as is said, fallen in love with her, tried, simply for the satisfaction of his lust, to get on intimate terms with her. But she, an honorable wife who knew her duty, would not yield to his advances. But while in this faithful wife of a European husband morality continued to triumph, there was nourished in this loathsome contemporary type, in proportion to the non-satisfaction of his lust, the desire for vengeance usual in such people, and by all sorts of intrigue he succeeded in getting her dismissed from her employment for no reason whatsoever. Then when her husband, my young friend, had finished his book and published it, this specific ulcer of our times, because of his resentment, began to write in the newspaper to which he contributed, and also in other newspapers and periodicals, a whole series of articles containing all sorts of false statements, which discredited the book so completely that it was a total failure. That is to say, no one became interested in it or bought it. And so, thanks to one of these inconscionable representatives of this unprincipled literature, things came to such a pass that this honest worker and his beloved wife, having spent their last resources and not having even the wherewithal to buy bread, by mutual pact, hanged themselves. From my point of view, these literary critics, owing to the influence of their authority as writers on the general mass of naive and easily suggestible people, are 1,000 times more pernicious than all the slobbering boy reporters. I myself knew a music critic, who had never once in his life touched a musical instrument, and therefore had no practical understanding of music. He did not even know what sound was in general, or the difference between the notes do and re. But, owing to the established abnormalities of contemporary civilization, he somehow occupied the responsible post of music critic, and thus became an authority for all the readers of a well-established and widely circulated newspaper. And it was, of course, according to his quite illiterate indications, that unshakable opinions were formed in all his readers on the question of music, that question which should in reality be like a beacon light for the correct understanding of one of the aspects of truth. The public never knows who is writing. It knows only the newspaper itself, which belongs to a group of experienced businessmen. What the person writing in these papers really knows, or what is going on behind the scenes in the newspaper office, the readers never know, but take everything written in the papers at its face value. According to my conviction, which has finally become as firm as a rock, and anyone thinking more or less impartially will come to the same conclusion, it is chiefly owing to this journalistic literature that any man who tries to develop by the means available in contemporary civilization acquires a thinking faculty adequate, at the very most, for the first invention of Edison, and in respect of emotionality develops in himself, as Mullah Nasr ad-Din would say, the fineness of feeling of a cow. The leaders of contemporary civilization themselves, standing on a very low level of morale and psychic development, are incapable, like children playing with fire, of knowing the force and significance of the effect of such literature on the mass of the people. According to my impression obtained from the study of ancient history, the leaders of former civilizations would never have allowed such an abnormality to continue for so long. This opinion of mine may be confirmed by authentic information which has come down to us about the serious attitude towards daily literature taken by the rulers of our country not so long ago. In the period when it was considered one of the greatest nations, namely when Great Babylon belonged to us and was the sole center of culture recognized by everyone on earth. According to this information, a daily press also existed there in the form of what are called printed papyri, although of course in an incomparable smaller quantity than now. But at that time, those who participated in such literary organs were only elderly and qualified persons, known to all for their serious merits and honorable lives. And there was even an established rule for appointing such men to these positions under oath, and they were therefore called sworn collaborators, just as now there are sworn juries, sworn experts, and so on. But nowadays any whippersnapper can be a journalist, so long as he knows how to express himself prettily and, as is said, literarily. I became particularly well acquainted with the psyche, and could in general evaluate the being of these products of contemporary civilization who fill the newspapers and periodicals with various wiseacrings, when for 3 or 4 months in that same town of Baku I happened to be present every day at their gatherings and to exchange opinions with them. This occurred in the following circumstances. Once when I had gone to Baku with the intention of staying all winter with my nephew, several young persons came to him and asked his permission for their new society of literati and journalists to hold meetings in one of the large rooms on the ground floor of his house, in which he had originally intended to establish a restaurant. My nephew at once gave his consent, and from the next day on these young people assembled, chiefly in the evenings, for their, as they called them, general meetings and learned debates. Outsiders were admitted to these meetings, and I often went to listen to their discussions. as I was quite free in the evenings and my quarters were very near the room where they assembled. Soon several of them began to converse with me, and friendly relations were gradually established between us. Most of them were still quite young, weak, and effeminate, and the faces of some showed clearly that their parents must have been drunkards or had suffered from other passions through willlessness, and that the possessors themselves of these faces had various bad habits concealed from others. Although Baku is only a small town in comparison with most of the large cities of today, and although the contemporary types who were assembled there represented at the most low-flying birds, I have no hesitation in generalizing about all their colleagues everywhere, and I feel I have the right to do this because later, when traveling in Europe, I often happened to come in contact with the representatives of this modern literature, and they all made the same impression on me, resembling one another like peas in a pod. The only difference between them was in the degree of their importance, depending upon which literary organs they contributed to, that is, depending upon the reputation and circulation of the newspaper or periodical in which their wiseacrings found a place, or upon the soundness of the commercial firm which owned both the given organ and all of them, the literary workmen. Many of them, for some reason or other, are called poets. At the present time, anywhere in Europe, anyone who writes even a short piece of nonsense of the order of "green roses, purple mimosas, divine are her poses, like hanging memories," and so on, is awarded the appellation of poet by those around him, and some of them even engrave this title on their visiting cards. Among these contemporary journalists and writers, esprit de corps is somehow highly developed, and they strongly support and immoderately extol one another on all occasions. It seems to me that this feature of theirs is the chief cause of their spreading sphere of influence and of their false authority over the masses, and also of the unconscious and servile adulation with which the crowd bows down before these nullities, as with a clear conscience one can call them. At the meetings in Baku which I've mentioned, one of them would go onto the platform and begin to read something of the order of the verses I've just quoted, or speak about why the minister of some nation had expressed himself during a banquet concerning some question or other in such a way and not otherwise, and then the lecturer would in most cases finish his speech by making an announcement more or less as follows: "I now yield the platform to an incomparable luminary of the learning of our time, Mr. So-and-so, who by chance has come to our city on a particularly important business and has been so kind as not to refuse to come to our meeting today. We will now have the privilege of listening to his enchanting voice with our own ears." And when this celebrity would appear on the platform, he would begin his speech with these words: "My dear ladies and gentlemen, my colleague has been so modest as to call me a celebrity." It must be said here that he could not have heard what his colleague had said, since he had come in from another room to which the door had been closed, and he had opened it himself when he came in, and I knew very well the acoustics in that house and the solidity of the doors. Then he would continue: "As a matter of fact, in comparison with him, I am not worthy even to sit in his presence. The celebrity is not I, but he. He is known not only everywhere in all our great Russia, but throughout the whole civilized world. Posterity will pronounce his name with palpitation, and no one will ever forget what he has done for learning and the future welfare of mankind. This God of truth is at present in this insignificant town not by chance, as it may appear to us, but doubtless for some very important reason known only to himself. In reality, his place is not among us, but beside the ancient gods of Olympus, and so on and so forth. And only after such a preamble would this new celebrity pronounce several absurdities, as for example on the theme, why the Sirikitsi made war on the Parnakalpi. After these learned sessions, suppers were always served, with 2 bottles of cheap wine, and many hid in their pockets some bit of hors d'oeuvre, either a piece of sausage or a herring with a piece of bread. And if by chance anyone else noticed this, they would usually say, "This is for my dog. The rascal already has the habit, always expects something when I return home late." On the day after these suppers, an account of the meeting always appeared in all the local papers, written in an incredibly pompous style. And the speeches were more or less accurately quoted, but of course no mention was made of the modesty of the supper or of the making off with a piece of sausage for the dog. Such are the people who write in the papers about all sorts of truths and scientific discoveries, and the naive reader, who does not see them or know their lives, draws his conclusions about events and ideas from the empty words of these writers, who are neither more nor less than inexperienced and illiterate as far as human life is concerned. In all the cities of Europe, with very few exceptions, the writers of books or newspaper articles are just such immature scatterbrains, who have become what they are owing chiefly to their heredity and their specific weaknesses. From my point of view, there can be no doubt whatsoever that of all the causes of the many abnormalities of contemporary civilization, the principal and most obvious one is this same journalistic literature, owing to its demoralizing and pernicious effect on the psyche of people. It astonishes me extremely that not a single government among all the peoples of contemporary civilization has ever become aware of this, and that not one of them, although expending more than half of what are called the government revenues on the maintenance of police, prisons, judicial establishments, churches, hospitals, etc., and on paying numerous civil employees such as priests, physicians, agents of the secret police, public prosecutors, propagandists, and the like, for the sole purpose of maintaining the fidelity and morality of its citizens, spends a single cent on undertaking something or other in order to destroy at its root this obvious cause of many crimes and misunderstandings. Thus ended the speech of this elderly, intelligent Persian. And so, my brave reader, who is perhaps already standing with one foot in galoshes, as I have finished with this speech, which I tacked on here only because, from my point of view, the ideas expressed in it could be very instructive and useful, especially for those adorers of contemporary civilization who naively consider it immeasurably higher than former civilizations in respect of the perfecting of human reason. I can now conclude this introduction and pass on to the reworking of the material intended for this series of my writings. In beginning to rewrite this material with the intention of giving it a form as understandable as possible and accessible to all, the thought has arisen in me that this work of mine should also be carried out in accordance with a very sensible counsel for living, often employed by our great Mullah Nasr-ud-Din, and expressed by him thus: "Always and in everything strive to attain at the same time what is useful for others and what is pleasant for oneself." As regards carrying out the first half of this very sensible counsel of our wise teacher, I have nothing to be concerned about, since the ideas I intend to introduce in this series will themselves abundantly fulfill it. But as regards what is pleasant for myself, this I wish to attain by giving to the pre-designed material a form of exposition which, from now on, will make my existence in some respects more bearable among the people who meet me than the one I had before my activity as a writer. In order that you may understand what I wish to convey by the expression bearable existence, it must be said that, after all my travels in those countries of the continents of Asia and Africa, which for some reason or other in the last 50 years have come to interest many people, I have long been reputed to be a sorcerer and an expert in questions of the beyond. And in consequence of this, everyone who met me considered that he had the right to disturb me for the satisfaction of his idle curiosity concerning these questions of the beyond, or to compel me to relate something or other of my personal life or some incident of my travels. And no matter how tired I might be, I was obliged to answer something, as otherwise people became offended, and feeling ill-disposed towards me, would always, whenever my name was mentioned, say something to harm my activities and belittle my significance. That is why, in revising the material destined for this series, I have decided to present it in the form of separate independent tales, and to insert in them various ideas which can serve as answers to all the questions often put to me, so that if I should again have to deal with these shameless idlers, I may simply refer them to this or that chapter, whereby they can satisfy their automatic curiosity. And this, at the same time, will give me the possibility of conversing with some of them merely by the flow of associations as is habitual to them, and will also sometimes provide a necessary breathing space for my active thinking, which is inevitably required in the conscious and conscientious fulfillment of my life obligations. Of the questions often put to me by people of various classes and different degrees of informedness, the following, as I recall, recurred most frequently. What remarkable men have I met? What marvels have I seen in the East? Has man a soul, or is it immortal? Is the will of man free? What is life, and why does suffering exist? Do I believe in the occult and spiritualistic sciences? What are hypnotism, magnetism, and telepathy? How did I become interested in these questions? What led me to my system practiced in the institute bearing my name? So, I shall now arrange this series in separate chapters, serving as answers to the first of the enumerated questions, namely, what remarkable men have I met? I will distribute in the separate tales about these meetings, according to a principle of logical sequence, all the ideas and thoughts that I intend to make known in this series, in order that they may serve as preparatory constructive material, and at the same time I will answer all the other questions often asked me. Furthermore, I shall arrange these separate tales in such an order that, among other things, there may stand out distinctly the outline of my, as it were, autobiography. Before going further, I consider it necessary to explain exactly the expression, a remarkable man, since, like all expressions for definite notions, it is always understood among contemporary people in a relative, that is, purely subjective sense. For example, a man who does tricks is for many people a remarkable man, but even for them he ceases to be remarkable as soon as they learn the secret of his tricks. As a definition of who may be considered and called remarkable, I will simply say, for the present, to cut a long story short, to what men I personally apply this expression. From my point of view, he can be called a remarkable man who stands out from those round him by the resourcefulness of his mind, and who knows how to be restrained in the manifestations which proceed from his nature, at the same time conducting himself justly and tolerantly towards the weaknesses of others. Since the first such man I knew whose influence left its trace on the whole of my life was my father, I shall begin with him.